Welcome to Things Go Sideways. I'm Kiki L'Italian, and this show is for those moments when life shifts, the old way stops working, and you're stuck in that weird middle where nothing feels stable yet. Today, it's going to be a little bit different. This isn't one of my traditional interviews. It's more like a guided tour. My guest is my longtime friend, Adrian Segar. He is someone who is known for designing gatherings that help people move from guarded to honest. He moves people from conversation to action. Adrian's going to walk us through a change model. It's 5 stages that explain why change often feels like chaos before it becomes coherent. And he's also going to share how he's used it in his own life as a way to stay oriented when things get hard. So, Adrian, I'm just going to let you lead. I'm going to jump in with questions along the way. I can't wait to see what you've got to share with us.
Well, thank you, Kiki. It's always a pleasure and delight to talk with you and have this opportunity to share something that I think is important. It's a powerful model of change. It's called the Satir Model of Change. It was developed by Virginia Satir, who was the founder of family systems therapy, pretty important branch of modern therapy. It was described first in the 1991 book, The Satir Model. And what's interesting about it, I have written about, there are all kinds of models of change, and I've written about some of those. This is my favorite, first of all, because I think it's the most powerful, but also it particularly appeals to me because it's about how stages of change feel, rather than like this happens, and then people do this, and then this happens, and it's sort of mechanical. This is a real model of change that it's applicable to personal circumstances. It's applicable to organizations, how organizations go through change. What I thought I'd do is I would do a very brief sharing of a diagram of the Satir model, and then use things that have happened in my life, 4 or 5 things that have happened in my life, and talk about how I've responded to those in the context of the model. And also you'll learn about many stories about my life, some of which I haven't really shared, certainly in this sort of format before. So this is interesting for me. I haven't done this before.
I'm super excited that you're going to do this. Thank you ahead of time, because one of the things as I'm talking with people about all of their sideways stories, how we approach that uncertainty that we feel, the ways that we decide what to do next, and just the emotions that we're going through. I think that everyone kind of goes through it and approaches it in a different way. But this idea of having a practical model to look at, I think, is just very valuable. So tell us more. I'm so curious to find out more about Virginia Satir.
Yes. And feel free to Google her. And actually, if you ever want to see how she did family therapy, there are some wonderful videos on YouTube, ancient videos of her actually doing therapeutic practice, and you can see what an incredible therapist she was.
Okay.
She actually worked with a mentor of mine, Jerry Weinberg, who, then introduced this model to me and many other people in his workshop. So I didn't invent any of this stuff. But I think what's valuable about this, and maybe valuable for people who are listening, is it provides a framework for people to understand how they're experiencing sideways moments. And that's why I'm excited about offering it to you. So here's a diagram of Satir's model of change. The y-axis is called performance, which you could think of from an organized point of view, and the x-axis is time. So the basic model, and I'll explain it pretty quickly, is this. So at any moment in our life, and this model repeats anytime there's a change in our lives, and this is what Virginia said, we start off with what she called the old status quo. So our life is at a particular stage. Everything is sort of relatively stable. The thing that is going to get changed is sort of an equilibrium. There's little oscillations here and there. And then suddenly, at some point, something that she called a foreign element appears. I'll give you some examples of those later. It's a shock to the system. Suddenly things are different. And it's kind of clear that your life will never be the same again. That something has to happen as a result of this. And what Virginia said is at that point, and I love her description of this, we go into chaos. If this is happening to you, the state that you are in at that point afterwards, she calls chaos. And that means it's a really turbulent state. A lot of emotions are going along. You might be frightened. You might be worried. You might be exuberant, even, like wildly exuberant. This amazing thing has happened and so on. And how am I going to deal with it and so on? All kinds of emotions come up. And that is a normal thing when something initiates change, when the foreign element initiates change. And as you'll see from some of my personal life examples, the time that chaos goes on is really unknown and can vary immensely. We'll get to that with the examples. But eventually, at some point, there is what Virginia called a transforming idea. And again, she built this model in sort of a therapeutic context, but it is completely applicable to any kind of change that happens in any kind of context, personal or organizational. So at some point, a transforming idea occurs. Something happens that changes, that gives you essentially a route out of chaos. There's something that can happen that moves you out of chaos. And then Virginia said, what happens in practice, and this is true, certainly from my experience, and I think most people's experience, is there's a period of time when that transforming idea has to work its way into your life. It's not like suddenly everything is fine again, or you're not in chaos anymore. You move and there can be more foreign elements that happen in that process. In one of my examples, this thing has happened multiple times over many years. But she called that integration and practice. So you are basically taking this idea and incorporating it into your life so that your life changes. And eventually you realize one day, or maybe 3 days later, it depends, you realize you are in a new status quo. So you've gone through the change. Things are not what they were. You're in a different place in a new status quo. And you stay in that new status quo until, of course, the next foreign element comes in and change has to happen again.
I feel very familiar with the foreign element and then chaos part of things. I feel like right now in my life, I'm experiencing somewhat of the transforming idea, maybe at the beginning of that part where it's,
Oh, but
you know.
from our conversation before this started, I think you're totally right. And that integration in practice, I mean, it's interesting, as you'll see. Sometimes the chaos can be very short. Sometimes it can be very long. The integration in practice can be pretty short, or it can be very long. So I think it's a very flexible model. And I like it because it puts the framework around change. And since we all go through change, any kind of framework that helps us to understand what's going on, particularly the feelings that are happening during it, which is something that happens. The rest of the time, if we're in the old status quo, we're kind of, there may be feelings involved, but we're kind of, well, we do this and I do that and then that happens. And then the next day I do something similar and so on. That's what status quo is.
Can we talk a little bit more about the emotions that go into this? Because,
Sure.
I can tell you that for me, and I think a lot of people I've talked to, there's a degree of resistance or a degree of, do I really have to change? Do I really have to go through this? Do I really have to do something different? No matter what that thing is, for real, we really have to change this? Because it's clearly an uncomfortable situation to have to go through that change. And I love seeing the bumpy part of the chaos, because that's for sure what it feels like if I were to map it out. But we don't want to feel that in general. Most of us don't. And so is that part of what Virginia teaches in this, is that some of those emotions are things like resistance?
Oh, I'm sure Virginia in her lifetime came up with resistance and certainly wrote about resistance and so on. I'm thinking of another model like Kubler-Ross's model about when you hear you're going to get a diagnosis that you're going to die.
Yeah.
Okay. And we have those stages. And the first one is denial, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't want to have to change.
And that is what that's about. So there are all these different parts. And again, in Virginia's model, it's kind of like a higher level model. though she was brilliant at actually delving into the chaos and understanding it and looking at the feelings that came up, including resistance. And maybe there'll be some illustration of that in the examples that I give shortly. But you're totally right. Denial is a very common response to changes. And sometimes you've been denying stuff for a long time. And the foreign element is the thing that forces you to confront the fact that you have to change or you have to make a difference in your life. You have a marriage that's failing or something like that, and you put up with it for years. And then one day your partner says, I want a divorce or whatever. And you don't have much choice about that, but you've been denying that things are bad and so on.
There are so many people that are going through professionally, they're going through a lot of changes. We hear about layoffs, we hear about job insecurity. And, I used to live in the DC metro area, and my sister still lives there. And wow, talk about like some rocky times for people who work for the government, not being sure about what's going to be happening. So, do you have examples where change has hit in your life professionally and you've suddenly been thrust into going through this model yourself?
So what I'd love to do, I'm going to talk about my professional life. I've done about 5 different things in my life. And I'm going to talk about my life and talk about how I changed the things that caused me to change from one thing to the next thing. And that also includes obviously some personal things. So it's not like I didn't, say, oh, I'm going to change my job or something like that. My life has not been like that. Let me tell you my story, and I think this will all make most sense and fit it into the model, each piece in the model as I go along. So the old status quo, very briefly, I was born in England, and I spent 25 years of my life getting a PhD in high energy particle physics. I was just fascinated. I was really curious about the world. I wanted to understand the world, and physics seemed to be the way to do that. And so I spent 25 years. I'm just about to get my PhD. I'm living in England. I go to the United States with my fiance, now my wife of just about 50 years, who is an American, and we visit Vermont for the weekend. And I am there for 24 hours. I'm very quiet, and I wake up in the morning and I say to Celia, you know what? I think I'd like to live here. And you should understand that I'm working on these huge accelerators at big universities and so on. And there's no way I can do that kind of work and live in Vermont. But I had this totally intuitive feeling that I wanted to move to rural Vermont. So that was a foreign element, the sudden experience. So then I'm in chaos. And it's a good kind of chaos. It's like, I want to do this. I have no idea how to do it. How do I move to America and earn a living? I'm a grad student. I'm just about to get my PhD. So I get my PhD. I look for jobs. I have no idea how to make a living in Vermont. I look for jobs in the United States. I get an offer as a postdoc at Tufts, and I moved to Boston. We moved to Boston, and I work on big particle accelerators while I'm trying to figure out how I can move 120 miles or more to Vermont, a neighboring state. And during that time, I'm unhappy with my work and my colleagues at Tufts. I realized I don't want to spend the rest of my life working with these people. So I'm ready to leave physics, which is bizarre because I've spent my whole 25 years kind of getting to this point. And anyway, what happens is there's the transforming idea. Some friends of mine who are in Vermont, in Brattleboro, Vermont, southeast corner, they decide to start a solar energy business. It's the time of the oil crisis. Oil prices are sky high. And all over the country, people are saying, oh, there's this thing called solar energy. We can build solar systems.
Okay, so you saw an opportunity.
Right. So the transforming idea is I do that, and then the integration and practice. So we moved to Vermont, and I've never run a business in my life. I'm an academic. I've just been in academia my whole life. I learned to run a business. I learned a lot from that. And during the next 5 years, I learned to run, and at a peak, we have maybe a dozen employees. And we're building solar hot water systems and selling them all over New England and installing them. And I feel really good about that, doing our little thing for the environment and go solar. And so the time frame, just put this in Virginia Satir's model, the time from between the foreign element, I realized I wanted to live in Vermont, and the new status quo was about 2.5 years. I had to move to the States, get a job temporarily in my old field, figure out how to make a new field, and so on. 5 years go by of the new status quo. I'm running this business. And then the business is going well. So this is part two. Business is going well, but it's not great. It's a really difficult time. Reagan gets in the presidency. Reagan takes the solar collectors off the White House. But more importantly, I have occasional disagreements with my business partner about the direction of the business. It's a seasonal business. It's a tough business to be in. And the foreign element is one day he comes in on Friday and says, I don't want to work with you anymore.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So let me guess. For an element.
That was a foreign element. Like, what am I going to do? I need to make money. My wife is working. I currently, she was going back to school to be an occupational therapist, but it's like we are living on a shoestring here. And I suddenly have no work. This guy is throwing me out of the business. So I'm in chaos that weekend, literally that weekend. And on Saturday, the next day, my wife walks with our neighbor on our driveway, whose husband is the former dean of faculty of this tiny liberal arts college in my town, Marlborough College, now unfortunately no longer, which I had taught a couple of sabbatical replacements in physics because I have this physics degree and they knew me, but I just did that in my spare time during doing the solar business. And she tells my wife, oh, you know something? They've been looking for someone to teach computer science part-time, and they haven't been able to find anyone. Remember, we're living in the middle of nowhere in rural Vermont, and computer science was a relatively new discipline at that time. This is late 70s. So I go to meet the dean of faculty who I know at the college on Monday, and he says, Adrian, we'd love to have you as professor of computer science. When can you start? And so my new status quo is I start teaching computer science. And I also start consulting in IT. That's the integration and practice. I start teaching part-time. I kind of learned to become a teacher, a college teacher. And I also start doing independent IT consulting because my teaching is a part-time job and I need extra money. So the time there from the foreign element, you don't have a job here anymore, to the new status quo was 3 days.
Oh my God. Okay, hold. So this is a great example of where these different stretches of time can be very short
Yeah.
or very large, because here you have the foreign element, the chaos, and then the transforming idea into this new status quo. I'm looking over here because I have drafted your chart. I'm like, that was incredible. So like 3 days, you said?
I was very lucky. I was extremely lucky. I mean, who knows what could have happened, but the timing was, the God smiled on me, whatever you wanted to say. The timing was perfect. And I started teaching. And again, talking about silver linings, which I'd like to do if we have time, about all these things. As I said, Reagan got into the Oval Office, solar energy, which was this really booming thing. Everybody kind of forgot about it for about 20 years until energy costs went up again. And my partner went on by himself and he had to close the business a year or two later anyway, because he just didn't have the business anymore. So in fact, he did be my partner, who I reconciled with, I was pretty upset with him at the time. But now it's like, I've told him this, you did me a big favor. You got me out of this industry that I wasn't going to get out of. Otherwise, I was going to struggle on and try and make it work. And I got into teaching, which I don't feel I was brilliant at, but I got better at. It gave me a lot of practice. I taught there for 10 years. And it got me into IT consulting, which actually was an extremely good career for me. I turned out to be really good at it. There was a lot of work, all word of mouth. And I basically did IT consulting for 20 years and had all the work I could handle. So that turned out to be
a gift.
It was a gift. It really was a gift. So sometimes these foreign elements, changes in your life, are a blessing. It was a blessing in a sense. And again, the transition, the shock was pretty brief, those 3 days. So I have plenty of work. So the old status quo now is I have plenty of work. And in the time, we also adopted twins from Korea. As infants, they were 4.5 months old. We already had a daughter who was 11 when they came, and so on.
I'm thinking of how this overlays with, as you're going through this professionally, when you adopted, is this after you had become the computer science professor?
Yes, and the IT.
And had you already had your daughter by that point?
Yes. Our daughter was just going into her teens when we adopted Leanne. And so she went through, her adolescence and so on while all this was going on. And then the other thing that I did, because I was doing administrative, I was doing sort of two part-time jobs. And over those 10 years, they turned into essentially two full-time jobs. I was also doing administrative computing at the school. And that was one of the things that led me to start this conference that's now been going on for 32 years, which was the first of the kinds of conferences that I design and facilitate. Now, I was doing administrative computing, and administrative computing was using small computers at small schools. With personal computer had just come in, was a whole new field. No one had ever done it before with PCs. Colleges had big mainframes, and there were IT staff who programmed this big mainframe with punch cards or terminals and so on. And I went to the president of the college and said, after a few months of there, and I said, there are these things called PCs. You don't have to store admissions records on pieces of paper anymore. When someone comes for an interview, we can put that in a database, thing called a database on a computer, which were new on personal computers. And we can afford, this tiny college can afford to buy these things now. So I did that. Hundreds of other people across the country were doing that at the same time. I created, and several other people said, let's have a conference to talk about doing this because no one's ever done it before and we could learn from each other. And so that turned into, that was in 1992. I organized a conference, a 3-day conference on that. And I was forced to design that conference differently from every conference, which I had done a lot of conferences because deep in my psyche, which I wasn't really aware of, was this desire to connect people around things that were important to me. I've always done that. I didn't recognize that I was doing that. But when I was an academic, I did conferences on particle physics. I organized those and so on. When I was in solar energy, I organized probably some of the first solar energy conferences in the United States. So I always loved doing that. Anyway, so I did this, and I had to develop a different kind of conference because there were no experts in figuring out how to do administrative computing on small computers. So that was a thing that basically was going on, but that was just one conference I was doing, and some people found out about it, and I did those kinds of conferences. But that was still in the background. I was still doing my IT consulting mainly. And what happened was, so I had full-time jobs. I'm working a lot. I've got the kids from Korea. I'm tired. I go on vacation in Maine, taking a break, and I'm eating a lobster dinner. I always remember this. I'm relaxed. I'm eating a lobster dinner with my wife in Maine. And out of my mouth comes the words, I don't think I want to teach at Marlborough College anymore. I've got 2 full-time jobs. And if you had asked me 10 minutes earlier, was I going to say this? No, it just came out. And I felt relief as soon as I'd said it. And I'd written about this, about how sometimes, and this is a weird example, there was kind of chaos going on underneath the surface here in my life. It was like, I have 2 full-time jobs. I kind of like both of them, but this is too much. And that was the chaos under the surface. And in some sense, you could say the foreign element was me coming to consciousness in that moment while eating the lobster that I needed to make a change. So the transforming idea was almost exactly the same thing. It was like, leave teaching, just do consulting, because I love doing consulting and I had plenty of work and so on. So there, the two were kind of almost related. I mean, I had to go and resign and so forth, but that was a relatively simple thing. So from moving from 2 full-time jobs to just one took 3 months, till the end of the school year. And I resigned and said, I'm not coming back.
This is kind of wild for me to hear this because I've known you for quite some time. I have your books, and spoiler alert for anybody who doesn't know Adrian, this is not what I know him for. None of this. The part about bringing people together, yes. None of what you've talked about so far is what you are really recognized for as far as how people know you in the industry and all around.
Well, I think it's really important to tell the story of how you get there. I mean, so often we see someone who we admire, and that's what we know. But the story of how they got there is often it can be interesting, illuminating, and so on. And it's cool that you haven't heard it. And I'm happy to share it because it's how I got there. I mean, it's a part of how I got there. And there's a piece that's coming up, which basically moved me from doing these conferences that I love to do, but was doing as a total amateur in my spare time because I had some compunction and desire to. And I had initially this need. It was like, I can't do a traditional conference for these people who are coming from all over the country because there are no experts. So I have to, but what are we going to do together for 3 days? We all do this thing. And how do I design those 3 days to make it great for people? Because I can't just have people lecturing at us, telling us how to do it, which is how I had done, when I did solar energy conferences, I invited people who knew about solar energy and they would come and speak to us. We would ask them questions, this typical kind of stuff. Anyway, meanwhile, my kids are growing up, my twins are growing up, my older daughter is in college and so on, but my twins are going out and they enter high school. And this is, in one way, is I think one of the hardest parts of my life. They become, I can't go into a lot of detail, but they seem to become totally different people overnight. And, it turns out now no one had warned us of this and no one really knew about this at the time. But adopted kids, many kids have difficulties in adolescence. Most kids do. Everybody does have some kinds of difference. It's an incredibly transformative time in anyone's life. But adopted kids have all kinds of additional factors that make it much more likely that they have a much harder adolescence in general, not always, than kids who aren't adopted. And our kids went into really seriously dangerous behavior. I'll just put it that way. And they were totally defiant with us when we called them on it. And we got to the stage and our adoption agency had said, oh, you're pretty well-adjusted people. Your kids will be okay. And we were in shock because no one had told us this could happen. We were totally unprepared for it. And we didn't feel ultimately that we could keep them safe.
Wow. Hard. Oh, that's hard, Adrian.
And again, I would want to say that I think learning what we've learned a lot over the years that maybe we would have done things differently. I'm not saying we could have done a better job. I think we did do the best job we could at the time with what we knew. But if we somehow magically could be the people who we are now, at that time, we would have made some different choices. But anyway, what we did, because we didn't know any other way and we were advised to do this, we sent them to schools away from us that would keep them safe. There's special kinds of schools. It's a complicated story. So we went into chaos. And this is a long story that hasn't been over yet. It's been 25 years. And I think I'll just say that our daughter is in a pretty good place. She just got accepted for a master's in social work at Smith last week. But it's been a long and winding road, and our son is still in the middle of a story that I'm not even going to get into. So they went to these schools, and our daughter's school was unusual in that it had workshops for the kids, multi-day workshops for the kids. It was an all-girls school. The girls went through the workshops, and there were this was very unusual, there were parent versions of these workshops. And Celia and I, my wife and I, went through those workshops, and I found them very impactful. I learned a lot about myself in that time. And eventually, and that person who created the school allowed parents who wanted to come back and staff these workshops. And I ended up going back and staffing these workshops, which means leading small groups of people going through these workshops on and off for like 15 years. And you're working. And that work was really fundamental in me understanding, getting a lot of experience in group process, and also discovering a core part about the work that I do professionally now, which is if you give people safe spaces, and it's not something you can just, now this space is safe. But if you basically create a safe, what they may find safe enough place for them to talk about things, then a lot of wonderful things can happen. And people will share things that are really important for them to share and get support about them. And they may share things that they've hardly ever shared to anybody else in their life. I would go through these workshops with these complete strangers, and after a few days, we would all know each other better than almost anyone else in their lives in some very important ways. And I felt that that was a gift in some ways, and how you use it is up to you. So the transforming idea out of that was I took that and I wanted to create those kinds of possibilities, not like deeply therapeutic, very, very intimate situations where people are talking about really difficult things that have happened in their life, but in a way which people could do if they wanted to, but doesn't really happen. But at a conference, a traditional kind of conference, allowing people to talk about the things that were important to them and to find out the people that they could connect with and give them the best opportunity for that to happen. There's no guarantees.
So, did you know at that time, as you've gone through and then interacted in these different sorts of workshops with these other parents, were you already thinking of how you could apply that to the types of conferences that you were putting together, or had that not gelled yet?
No, no, it hadn't. I was immersed in that. I was still doing IT, but my IT, I've decided, I guess it was around 2000 or so when, the internet bubble burst. There were a lot of people who'd been paid a lot of money and hadn't been working as consultants for very long, but, been paid well. And they flooded the market looking for consulting work. And I went from like having maybe 3 or 4 times as much work as I could handle to about this amount of work I could handle, and I had work. And then one day I said to myself, I just offered a piece of work. And I thought, I don't really want to do this anymore. I've been doing this for 20 years. And there was this moment, and maybe that was the foreign element there, where someone offered me work. And I thought, I don't want to do IT anymore. I want to write a book. And again, that was the moment where I gave up IT consulting, which had treated me very well for 20 years. And maybe it was the moment when I thought, I want to write a book. I can't remember exactly when I thought, I want to write about this because I've been doing these conferences, again, as an amateur. I don't think I'd ever got paid to do them, but I love doing them. And I love bringing people together and feeling good about creating stuff. I did stuff at an association level, regional level in my region, which made a huge difference. I did a conference, for example, that basically built these centers. The end result was that every town in my region set up organizations to support the elders in the region to have the support that they needed as they grew older and had less resources and less capabilities and so on. So that was, I love doing that kind of work. And no one knew when we ran that conference that that would be an outcome. So I love creating the possibilities for change through bringing people together who had the power collectively to come up with good ideas and creating change. So the last piece was I gave up IT consulting and then spent 4 years struggling to write my first book. And that came out in 2009, and event camps had just started. And I went to the first event camp in New York City, I think early 2010.
You have to do what the book was about because that's a huge part of what we're talking about here.
Right.
The fact that it was this bringing people together, this idea about design, which, if anyone's keeping track of all these shifts and changes and what you've been doing, what I think is fascinating in your story, and I'm so glad that you're giving us these examples for this framework because you can clearly see how these sideways stories in your life led to the life that you've lived. Like it led you to this book and this whole new career, this whole new branch of your life.
I think in the fundamental sense, all the things I've described have helped me figure out who I am and how I want to be in the world professionally and personally and so on. And yeah, this is the book that I wrote, Conferences That Work, Creating Events That People Love. And that's the book that took me 4 years to write. It came out in 2009. And I went to this event camp in New York City, the first of these kind of alternative events for event professionals who were like, there must be a way that we can talk about what we're doing and make it better. It was very ad hoc. And it was all volunteer. No one got paid to do this. And I heard about this, went to it, and suddenly met people. And people said, oh, this is so interesting. And suddenly I was in the meeting industry, which I knew nothing about.
It's so wild. I met you not long after that. And you were considered an expert. You'd written this great book, and people were passionate about it already and about the work that you were doing. And so to hear this backstory and how it all led to who you are now, who you became, and understanding what was underneath. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I really do want to emphasize what I call silver linings in all this. We go through these sideways moments, and the ones we tend to remember are the ones that are painful, that are like, I have to change. I can't do this. I can't stay in the old status quo anymore, and so on. And at the time, and we're in chaos, which is not pleasant. No one really likes being in chaos. I mean, sometimes you can have a kind of excitement chaos. That's not really what this is about. Virginia Satir is more about it's the kind of chaos where you're being forced to, or you have this inner desire that's very strong that cannot be denied to change something in your life or many things in your life. And the point I want to make from these stories is that certainly for me, have been silver linings in all of them. Even, the situation with my twins is not completely resolved. And, there's still some sort of dark places there. But professionally, it has led me to this place, as I just described, that I wouldn't have got to otherwise. I think I said to you earlier before we started this interview that if this hadn't happened with my kids, maybe I'd still be doing IT consulting. I don't know. I have no idea. And it's not like I was not unhappy about it, but it was like, I don't want to do this anymore. But maybe I wouldn't have been in that place if I hadn't been brought to this realization that I love to do, work with groups and do things that are helpful for groups of people coming together who have a common interest and want to make changes or learn from each other or connect with each other or figure out how to do new things, how to create events to do that, which is what I do these days. And it's a work in progress. Who knows? Maybe I'll stay doing this work. It's very possible I'll stay doing this work, but I also don't want to be in a situation that I feel I don't want to get, in some sense, being able to not be stuck. And I do meet people, maybe too many people, who I think are stuck to their detriment. They're in a career they're not very happy with. Maybe they're in a relationship they're not very happy with. There's no blame here.
Yeah.
But I like the fact in my life that, and I'm not saying that I immediately responded to a foreign element in my life as quickly as maybe I could have done or should have done or whatever that means. But I love the fact that I've been open to that. And I feel that it has really helped me figure out who I am. And for me, that's very important because, as I say, be yourself, everyone else is already taken. Who else would I want to be but who I am? And all these sideways moments have helped me move towards being a more authentic kind of person. And it's an ongoing process. But I'm very happy. So sideways moments, I guess the sort of conclusion would be that sideways moments, if you are lucky enough and have the right psyche and courage and whatever else is necessary, I don't know what it is, to face them honestly and openly, then in my experience, they can lead to really positive change. And I think that's the thing that I would want to, if anything, for people to take away. And to take that, sometimes we want to take those risks. I mean, look at giving up my professional career as a physicist. I just spent 25 years of my life becoming this thing, and then I throw it away after a year, postdoc year, and do something completely different. And I'm not saying everyone should do that. And there are plenty of people who are like, I've done this all my life, and I'm super happy that I found out that I wanted to do this when I was 20 years old. But I think there are a lot of people, and I think particularly in the world these days where everything is changing, where jobs are changing and culture is changing and politics are changing, society is changing so quickly, the likelihood that you can start off doing something in your life and stay with it forever is a much smaller likelihood than it used to be.
I think that this has been super helpful for people maybe who are grappling with the instability in looking at how technology is shifting the markets. You've talked about massive changes in career and direction and working for others, working for yourself, and in different fields, and exploring when something is shifting and that foreign element arrives in your life. Yeah, it feels chaotic and you are going through chaos, but you've also demonstrated, I think, through your own examples, how that can lead to these new paths that we're not saying that everything's perfect and shiny and brilliant, but we're saying that there are these silver linings that can take you in magical directions that you never would have maybe guessed in the beginning. So If someone is listening and they're in resistance or chaos right now, and they feel behind, they feel unsteady, or maybe they feel like they could be handling it better, what do you want them to remember from your story here today?
Well, let's talk about the chaos for a moment. I think a very important thing for people to know is that chaos is normal. It is a natural part of change. You can't have change without chaos. I mean, well, maybe the weekend version I gave you was very short piece of chaos, but it was intense. Then it was over, luckily, because I got a job on Monday. But chaos is normal in change. So when you're experiencing this stuff, and at the time, this is all about feelings, but it's helpful to know this is how it is. And I think that can be very comforting. I mean, I'll say that these days, it's not like no bad things ever happen to me anymore. I'm still getting foreign elements in my life all the time. My wife was just diagnosed with Parkinson's a year ago, and we were adjusting to that. But these days, knowing that that's normal, and with my experience of what change can be like, and also the positives as well, and there are often positives, even about very serious events like illness and impending death and so on, knowing that it's normal gives you a perspective that helps you move through it. I know that when what happened to my kids happened, I was really completely bound up in what is going to happen tomorrow, and is this terrible thing going to happen, and will they be okay, and so on. And that was consuming. And if I had maybe known what I know now, I would have had more equanimity, not that everything would be fine about it. So I think understanding that chaos is normal, it's a normal part of change, and working with it is painful and difficult, and also that, at least until you die, that there usually are transforming things that happen. You don't necessarily stay in chaos forever, though it sure feels like it at the time. And that's why I wanted to give some of the examples. Chaos might last a few days, a year, decades, but it is a part of what is going on. And having that knowledge, I think, is comforting in the sense it doesn't fix the problem. It doesn't change the emotions, but it puts the emotions in a context that allows you to deal with them better, I think.
Adrian, I want to thank you for sharing your story, for sharing the model also. I think that learning from Satir about this model of change so that we can understand that all of the moments doesn't mean we're a bad person because we hit chaos. It doesn't mean we're a bad person because a foreign element's introduced. It's this normal part of change, a normal part of life. And so I think it's truly helpful that you were able to share that with us and be open enough to share the examples from your own life. Obviously, wouldn't ever want to have you go through any chaos, but I'm thankful for who you are today and that I had the chance to call you friend and to have learned from you for many years now. So thanks for all of that.
I have always liked you as a person and just really appreciate the work that you've done in so many ways. And I know that much of what I've said today resonates with you, and you know it as part of what has been going on in your life and will continue to go in your life. So I'm really grateful to you to give me the time to be able to share it with you and with anyone else who is interested. I value our friendship and very grateful that we're in each other's lives and that we have this opportunity to do good work together like this.
Me too. Everyone listening, you don't have to resolve it today. You just have to stay present long enough to notice what's changing inside you. Be well, and we'll see you next time.